Tonight's presentation is general advice only. So if you hear something that sounds interesting, you want to implement it tonight, just make sure you get some advice from a suitably qualified person, like your advisor, before you go off and implement anything. So ageing, along with death and taxes, hopefully is an inevitable process that we all get to enjoy. And but like some of the journeys that we have on life, it doesn't necessarily happen the way we may expect. And so tonight we're going to have a look at some of, I suppose, the ways in which there's services available to help people who are ageing do so gracefully. We're going to look at the costs of those services, and also how some of these the strategies and the issues around aged care impact on your estate plans, and some of the things to perhaps be aware of when we're looking at funding for aged care. But first, bit of background. The demographic shifts are quite evident. This graph here shows the numbers as well as proportion of society that are going to be above both 65 and also 85 in years to come. Clearly, the demographic shift, people are living longer. The baby boomer shifts bubble as well is part of this, but it really the main driver behind this is longer living and I think these graphs here probably show a bit of the different story. And what we're looking at here is, yes, you may live longer, but we're looking at the proportion of the years that you have in your retirement age where you're independent living with some assistance, and then dependency, where you're actually dependent on others for activities of daily living. And that, I think, is one of the key aspects of aged care, is that whilst we've got, as a population, we are living longer and medical advances are allowing us to do so, it's not necessarily extending this bit here, which we're healthy and living independently. It's actually expanding this bit up here, where we've got a level of dependency on others to live our lives, which is not necessarily what we're all looking for. But that's come into things. So, aged care. When you look at it, you've got living independently, then you start moving into supported living arrangements, retirement villages, maybe some care at home, and then you've got residential aged care, which is what most people focus on for aged care. But it's important to remember that only 25% of the population access residential aged care. Most people get through their lives not having to go into residential aged care. Most of the time, 3/4 of the population will live out their lives at home with a bit of help from family, friends, or maybe some government support. So it's not all bad. The Commonwealth Home Support Program, which happens in here, that's like your local government arranged services, so your Meals on Wheels, your bit of home nursing, that sort of stuff, maybe some transport assistance, things like that. So it's fairly low-level assistance, but it's also fairly low cost, often very heavily subsidised by the local government, maybe a small fee. Your retirement villages, which we're not going to talk about in detail tonight, that's a similar sort of thing where you've got independent living, but there's some services in the community in which you're living, maybe some extra support if you're struggling with food and things like that, maybe some care and emergency stuff. Then you're looking at home care, and the reason we're looking at home care next is that at that stage you need to have an assessment by the aged care assessment team to get access to those services which are government subsidised. And there's 4 levels of care. It's personal care, social support. help with some medical needs. They're really only suitable for people who either have a spouse living with them or have family who are there to help them. It's not really for people who can't cope on their own in their own home, because it's not going to work. You actually need a support mechanism around the person, be that family or a spouse to help. You can't get access to home care services unless you've been assessed by an aged care assessment team. I'll go through what that means in a moment. And that'll probably be enough on those. And then I suppose the next one we lead into these into residential care. And look, that's residential care gets everyone's attention because of the supposedly big costs, and we'll go into some of that later. But really, it's also where we see the confusion start to appear with the funding arrangements as well, and how are we going to fund this? How much do we need to put aside for it? And it's for those who can no longer live independently at home. For those who want to start getting some care, the first step would be, if they're struggling, and this is, I think about my family situation with my grandparents. The first stage for them has been accessing the local government services, getting someone in to help with the cleaning, some transport arrangements, and also particularly to and from doctors, and also to the shops. So that's fairly and a meal arrangements. Although grandfather hated the meals, he found light and easy much better. So, and it was just there are commercial arrangements that if you've got the wherewithal to use those, they sometimes can be a better outcome as well. He reckons he's tried just about every one of them now. And there's no assessment of need necessarily there by anyone independent. Then we move to home care. So to get into home care, it's not an overly expensive. To get home care in, you've got to be assessed by an aged care assessment team. It means that they assess your level of need, and that'll rank you in whether you're level 1, 2, 3, or 4, and that will then determine the level of services that you are able to get that are government subsidised. You can always pay for more services, and I think that's the key thing, is you're not locked into just getting the services they provide. If you've got the wherewithal, you can pay for more. For those, there's a basic daily care fee that everyone has to pay. And then if you're someone who's got, if you're not a full pensioner, age pensioner, then you'll have an income tested fee that you'll also have to pay. The maximum you'll have to pay is about, for both those fees, would be $14,500 a year. Those fees go up all the time; they're indexed up. But there's also a cap. So there's a lifetime cap on these fees over here. You'll never, if you're in a situation where you need in-home care for many years, once you've paid currently about $64,715. Once you hit that cap, you don't pay any more means tested fees. So the only fee you'll be paying would be the $10 a day.
So does that mean if you live to 110, you could have?
You'd win. Yeah. You've won the lottery.
You might know you've won. But...
Details. So if you think, well, what would it take for you to be paying the maximum fee? As a single person, you'd have assets in excess of about $1.58 million, and for a couple, you'd have assets in excess of $2.42 million. So that's to pay the maximum home care fees. The way this is worked out is they work out your income as a couple. They'll work out your income, and then half of that is attributable to the one member of the couple who's getting the home care, if there's only one person getting it. If you're a single person, then obviously it's your assessable income.
No matter how much it is?
as in how much your income is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's based on your income. So your income, this is an income test only, not your assets. So the reason I use the asset picture is because they deem your assets to earn a certain level of income. So it's not the actual income your assets earn. But we don't want to get into the details of that, because the reality is that's the cost, and it will be what it is, but there is a maximum cost. And that's the message I want to get across, is that it's not a never-ending fee that goes on forever. Once you hit that lifetime cap of $64,000, then it just slips back to this $10 a day, $3,500 a year. So that's home care. But then when you're getting to residential care, there's a couple of steps to it. So the first step is you've got to get your assessment, your ACAT assessment. And that's going to assess your need. And once you're assessed as being needing residential aged care, that assessment, they'll assess you. It takes about an hour and a half. The way you get that assessment is generally done through your doctor. So your treating GP will arrange the ACAT assessment. The specialists come out and they do some tests with you. They look at your ability to comprehend stuff. And like my nana, she was great. She gamed the whole system. She was completely dependent on my grandfather, but she was able to game the questions, and she worked out what the answers needed to be so that she would be classed as not needing residential aged care. Smarter than she looked. It takes about an hour and a half to do that test, and then they'll write to you and tell you, yep, you're eligible. Once you've got that bit of paper, that'll last for 12 months. So it gives you 12 months to go and find an appropriate facility. So what you're looking for then is an accredited facility, one that's got government accreditation, because then you get the subsidised care. If it's not accredited, you're not going to get government assistance to pay the fees. And that's probably a key part, is that when you're looking at facilities, you're making sure that it's an accredited facility. Those accreditations, those facilities have to be audited every 3 years.
It's irrespective of your assets?
Yeah. This we'll come to that. Financing comes in that. So these places have to be audited every 3 years, and if they don't pass, then they lose accreditation. And that part of that is around service delivery and making sure they're at an appropriate level.
Guys, who does the accredited? Who the people are?
Government audits those.
Okay. So because I've seen cases that trick you, and they're trying to push the rating down, not to go over the threshold.
Oh,
so
no,
they don't have to contribute and all that, you know? Yeah.
No, this is about the quality of the service provision at the facility.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So when you're choosing a service, what I would suggest you don't do is think about the money first. What you really want to be looking at is the facility in a location that means that my family can still visit me? You know, if your family are in Melbourne and you choose a facility in Benalla, then it might be cheaper, but you might never see your kids ever again, which may be what you want. So think about where the location. Think about the type of amenities that the facility offers you, the activities. Is it a place that offers activities that you're interested in or not? And keeping in mind with residential care, it's not something you move out of. So you're going into residential care. This is going to be your home. And so you want to make sure that it's somewhere that you're going to feel comfortable and can feel comfortable, and feel that your family feels comfortable, that you're going to be well looked after. And I think that's probably the most important thing. When you're looking at residential aged care, the costs look pretty big. The cost of care, of providing care for someone in residential aged care, it can be over $100,000 a year. Fortunately, the government subsidises much of that. So the maximum that anyone would be paying for their care fees would be around $45,000 a year. Now, that's keeping in mind that's the maximum. But as I said earlier, these fees are also means tested, and once your means tested fees hit that magical cap of $64,000, so these fees also count towards that. You don't have to pay the means tested fees anymore. So if you've been getting care in home for a while and you might have racked up $30,000 of fees in home care, and then you've got to a point where you can no longer cope at home, so the next step on the bus stop is the residential care facility. After a couple of years, you might have already got to your means tested cap, which means the only fees you're going to be paying will be the basic daily care fees.
Excuse me, when you say means tested for entry to those residential places, what is included? Is it your cash
I'll come to that.
Right.
And you've got accommodation as extra, so I don't understand.
Yeah, I'll come to that.
Too inquisitive.
So I think perhaps we'll have a look at that. So the accommodation, first thing is you've got to have a room to live in. So think of paying and we used to call these bonds, but now they're called refundable accommodation deposits. And you can choose that to pay that as a lump sum, or you can pay that as a daily fee. Now, that buys you the room. So think of it in the context of buying your residence. If you're buying a house in Toorak, you're going to pay more than if you're buying a house in Carrum Downs. Same with the residential care facility. The care facility in a location like Brighton is going to cost more than a room in a care facility in Frankston. And that's the way the world works. You can choose to pay that as a lump sum, as I said, or as a daily accommodation payment. I suppose a note here is about those with low assets. So not everyone has millions of dollars, and if your assets are below $165,000 and you're going into aged care, you are classed as a low means resident. Now, what that means is you don't have to pay the lump sum refundable deposit or the daily accommodation payment. To pay for your accommodation, you pay a daily accommodation fee or a contribution that is calculated based on your means, on your ability to pay. So if you've got relatives, for example, who are not in a position who can fund their aged care because they're on the full age pension, they've got a few, maybe $10,000, $20,000 in the bank, and you think, well, how are they going to afford care? There's an option for them, and that option is that they don't have to pay that lump sum payment. Now, those daily accommodation Yep.
Is your house considered to
Yes.
be part of your
Yes,
asset?
it is. Your house is, but up to it's capped. So your house is counted towards. So if you're, I'll come to that. I'm actually going to cover that off in the financing. So can I just answer that in a moment, please? So the daily accommodation contribution is adjusted with as they're indexed upwards, and there's actually aged care facilities are required because they're accredited facilities. They're required to actually offer a certain number of low means beds or rooms in their facility. So there's actually a percentage, and that percentage will depend on the location of the facility. And so if that location is in an area where there's a high proportion of people with low means, then the minimum or the number of low means rooms will be higher than if that facility was just down the road here in Brighton. So one of the tricks to this is actually asking the facility what proportion of rooms in your facility are low means, because the answer to that question may mean you can negotiate for your way into that facility as a low means resident if you're a low means person, and get access to a pretty good quality facility, but as a low means person. But there tends to be a pretty big waiting list for those places. So it's just something you need to be aware of. And if you are classed as a low means person, so when you do the assets assessment, which is required for this process, if you are classed as low means, you cannot be unclassed as low means. Like once you're a low means person, you're a low means person. You
Even if you win tax order.
well, if you win, you can get reassessed if you come into money. But the key issue is that you can't then pay a refundable deposit, have someone else pay a refundable deposit for you to go into a facility because you won't have the means to pay the costs. The basic daily care fee everyone pays, and that covers just the daily costs of living, like food and things like that. And the means tested fees. This is the extra. This fee here is the fee that probably looks the most expensive when you first start out in aged care, because you think, how am I going to afford this forever? But that's the one that stops once you get to $62,000. It's capped, so that the means tested fee is capped at about just over $26,000 a year. So if you're in a situation financially where you are paying the full means tested fee, you can actually be paying more than the maximum amount. There's a calculation that is done to work out what your means tested fee is, and then you pay that along, and then once you get to the annual limit of $26,000, it stops, and you have to have no means tested fee until the anniversary of when you moved in, and then it kicks back in again, and it goes along at that level. Then once you hit that $26,000 for the year, it stops again. And that happens until you meet your lifetime cap, and then it just stops forever. So that's how the means tested fee works. The problem with that is that if you're not that well when you go into residential aged care, and you're paying at a high rate, and then you die, you may have paid at a higher rate than what you need to. And so and often that happens when people decide not to hand in all their details to Centrelink to get their assets and income assessed to get the fee appropriately calculated. So there's a positive to not being involved in the Centrelink side of things because it's a pain, but there's also a negative as well. The other services fees there, that's your extra services fee. So if you go into a facility, not all facilities offer extra services, but that's sometimes a choice of meals, wine with your dinner, extra facilities, extra curricular activities. Depending on the facility that you're in, there could be extra costs there. So when you move into residential aged care, you've got 28 days to make a decision as to whether you're going to pay this big lump sum refundable deposit or whether you're going to pay as a daily accommodation payment. Once you've made that decision, if you opt for the lump sum, then you've got 6 months to sort out how you're going to pay it. And you can do a combination of the two. And this is where advice comes into it, because restructuring your affairs to be able to pay these deposits, sometimes it's pretty cut and dry, and sometimes there's lots of different mutations and options that you can go through. So it's worthwhile sitting down with your advisor and actually going through, well, what if we do this option? What happens? What's the long term? What's the short term? What are the implications for our estate planning? There's lots of things to have a look at there. The refundable deposit is set by the facility. It's published on the aged care website, with the My Aged Care website, so you can actually go onto My Aged Care. And if you want to know any more about this stuff, I would suggest you go to the myagedcare.gov.au website. It's a brilliant website for information about aged care. Huge resource. The government's done an enormous amount of work there in getting that together. So I'm just checking another website I wrote down before. Must be further on. As I said earlier, it's a bit like buying a home, so it buys you the right to live there. It's fully refundable. So when you come out of the aged care facility, either in a box or you move to another facility, you get it all back.
You get it all back, or you?
Or your estate gets it all back. It's government guaranteed. So it's important to know that it is government, but only if you're in an accredited facility. It's exempt from the age pension. So that means that when you're, if you've got relatives or yourselves on the age pension, there is a bit of planning that we can do around maximising age pensions. And estate planning, you need to actually consider the impact of your estate planning, because if the source of the money is coming from a source that wasn't going to be originally part of your estate, but then you pay so for example, it might have been money sitting in a family trust, which is not that doesn't form part of your estate, and you pull the money out of the trust and you pay the $600,000 refundable deposit. When you die, that $600,000 deposit is part of your estate, it becomes yours. So you need to think about the estate planning implications of that, because if you purposely had all your money and assets in other entities because you knew that there was going to be a problem when you died because there was going to be a big squabble over your assets, but if you managed to get it in such a way that you died with nothing in your own name, so there's nothing in your estate to squabble over, then you've just undone all that good work because you've got the refundable deposit coming into your own name. So there's something that you do need to think about that process. This might answer the question. So, in determining aged care fees, your home is counted up to an amount of $165,000. That amount's indexed up, but only if you're the last one living there, really. So if you've got a spouse still at home, if you've got someone who was dependent on you, and there's a definition of what dependent means, and they're living in the house, then that house is not counted as an asset for you for determining the aged care fees. If you rent the house out, that income is assessable as well for the means test. It's a bit different for the age pension. So as you can see on the screen there, so there's some exemptions around when the home is going to be counted. A change that happened in January last year was that if you go into aged care now, the rental and you keep your home, but you rent it out to help pay the fees. What used to happen was the house wasn't counted as an asset and the rental wasn't counted as income for age pension purposes, but that's no longer available. So that's a change that has occurred. An example might be someone generally, and often I use the example of a widow going to aged care because statistically, fellas, we die first. And so often it's a widow moving into residential aged care, and if you've been to a residential aged care facility, you will notice that there's very few men in that facility. It's not because they're more independent, they're just not there anymore. And if you're in this situation where you've got assets of $550,000, most of it tied up in the family home, and you've asked to pay a bond of $300,000, the question is, well, how? How are we going to pay for that, and what are we going to do there? And this is where advice comes into it, because it's not just a simple question as, well, let's sell the home and deal with it, because there are other options, and we need to look at those options to determine what is the best option in this particular circumstance. It could be, do we sell the home? Do we rent it out? Do we use a reverse mortgage? The government has just, in the last budget, announced the update to the pension loan scheme, which allows you to effectively reverse mortgage from the government to assist you in paying for your living costs, which would be aged care fees. And that's actually a really good option for some people in this circumstance who don't want to sell their home, because you'll find with commercial operators of reverse mortgages, you won't actually be able to use a reverse mortgage if you're not living in the home. So generally what happens if you're living in home and you've got a reverse mortgage, then you move into residential care, that's one of the triggers that you actually have to pay back your reverse mortgage with commercial operators. With the government pension loan scheme, that's not the case. And then there's question of, well, how do you invest the capital that's left over? What's the best way to maximise the cash flow for this person so that they can pay their fees and potentially try and preserve some capital? But in the end, and underlying all of that, is the estate planning implications. Because really what we're looking at is, it's not just financial decision making. we're looking at the family and the emotional considerations. Has the family is that home been in the family for generations, and there's a reason why they want to retain it for the next generation? You know, think farmers with farms. Is the house going to go up or potentially go up or down in value depending on its location? Is it going to produce enough income to help fund the fees? What condition is the house in? Is, you know, if Madge is like some people, that often what happens is they put up with things, and the kitchen needs to rent out the property. You've got to update the kitchen, the laundry, all the expensive parts of the house to update, and suddenly you're looking at a big bill to update that home to get into condition to rent. Maybe it's not worth it. And then, and again, I keep coming back to these estate planning issues. So, I suppose just to bring that part to a close, what I wanted to highlight was that to navigate all those options, you know, you need some specialist advice. You can do it all yourself. Yes, you can. You can go and do the research you want. We've got the facilities to do that for you. So please come and see us if you need that help. If you're an age pensioner, or you're the person who you're helping through this process as an age pensioner, it's an exponential curve, the number of options that are open to them, but also the number of strategies we need to look at to optimise their position. And the other, I suppose, the main point I wanted to get across is in relation to the financing of aged care, and that is that it's not a never-ending bucket of money that you have to keep pouring out. There's options around the refundable deposit. You don't have to pay the full lump sum. You can pay that as a daily accommodation payment. You can part pay it depending on what the finance situation's like. The ongoing care fees are not something you have to be worried about. There is a cap on them. You've got the daily care fees. The basic daily care fee for home care is about $3,500 a year. The means tested fee is another $11,000 a year or thereabouts. So 6 years on home care will see you hit the cap. 5 and a bit years will see you hit the cap on the lifetime means tested fees. So if all you ever did was use home care fees, and you started those home care, if we go back to that earlier graph of dependency, and you started that in your mid-70s and you lived through till 90, for the last 10 years of that period, you're paying $3,500 a year to get and then you come to the residential care, and the average length of tenure in residential care is only about 3 years. You don't go there for a holiday. So, I'm sorry.
We're the one where you can go in for respite.
We've looked at two.
Yeah.
We've looked at two and actually said, come and actually have some respite time. You can get feel of the place, which is something we like to do because it gives you a much better understanding of what the facility could be like.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that's a really good point. And I did actually have it in my notes here, but I skimmed over it. Respite care is something that I would encourage you to make use of. When you're getting to that point where you're thinking, can I cope at home again anymore or not? It is really worthwhile going and trying a few facilities. If you don't like it, don't go back. It's that simple. To get access, you've got to have the aged care assessment done so that you're eligible for respite. But once you've done it, it's a great opportunity. And I think of my parents' neighbours, where unfortunately he's got Alzheimer's, and it's quite advanced, and he's becoming very difficult to deal with. And the best thing that they've done is been able to find some respite care locally where he can go into respite, and his wife gets a break. She doesn't have to lock herself in the toilet to have a cup of tea, which is seriously what she has to do. So it's not all roses. This can be a very, very difficult process and a very difficult time and a very emotional time for families to deal with. It takes a lot of understanding and a lot of care and a lot of love. So And if your family's not like that and not able to pull together like that, then you need to plan ahead, which probably brings me to estate planning.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
You said that an ACAT assessment was good for 12 months.
Yeah,
is
that's
that
right. Yeah.
So you have to renew it every 12
Once you've gone into care,
months. Right.
you're in care. So if to get access into the care system, you need an ACAT assessment. Once you've got that and you've gone into care and you've engaged in the process, my understanding is, and I'll be happy to go back and check again, is that you don't need to then go and renew that. Often what happens though is that your health declines and your cognitive abilities decline, and so you actually need to have that reassessment to then get a higher level of care to get access to more services. So that's sometimes it's actually a good thing to be reassessed. Is what I would suggest. What I want to move away from aged care for a bit, because this next topic of estate planning is actually linked quite closely, because as we age, we obviously become more aware of the diminishing number of years left. And I've split this into two parts. One part is that where we're still alive, but we can't look after ourselves, we can't make decisions anymore for ourselves. And then the next part is when we've parted this mortal coil. So I'm going to keep this fairly brief and fairly top level, because this could be a seminar in its own right. And I think it would be good to have a lawyer present on this rather than a financial advisor, because they bring something else to the equation. So I'm going to keep, and I certainly am not a lawyer. So enduring powers of attorney is the first way you can assist. First one is on for financial matters, and the second one is for medical treatment. If you hold financial power of attorney for someone, you can't decide what medical treatment they're going to get. For those of you who have self-managed superannuation funds, I believe, and I reckon most of my colleagues would back me up on this, that you should also, if you're prepared to have a self-managed super fund, you should also be prepared to have an enduring power of attorney in place. Because if you lose capacity and you're the only one left running your fund, who's going to run your finances for you? Who's going to sign off on the annual accounts? It's going to be really messy. So I would suggest that if you're, as part of the responsibility of running it as being a trustee of a self-managed fund, you should also have an enduring power of attorney in place. A solicitor can help you draft an enduring power of attorney. There is an alternative. You can go to the Office of Public Advocate at www.publicadvocate.vic.gov.au, and they've got a free interactive form that you can complete, and then you've got to execute it. What I would say is that if you don't know what you're doing, that might be a bit difficult to fill out. So just be careful there. But that is the government is quite interested in making sure that people have access to the facilities to make sure that you are able to look after your own affairs if you have the capability. The other thing I want to talk about is advanced care directives. So for those of you who have looked into this, you'll know what I'm talking about. These are something you do with your doctor, and they generally have this on file, on your medical file, and it's where you set out the way in which you want to be treated in certain circumstances. I would simply minded, do you flick the machine off or not? But it's more about do you want treatment to keep yourself alive or just to keep yourself comfortable? You can also, with your advanced care directives, you can also have a support person. So you can nominate a person who is going to have access to your medical files, can have discussions with your doctors and the nurses and your specialists, and then help you make a decision. And that, in today's privacy world where no one's information is going to be given out to anyone without authorities, this is probably a good idea to have that in place. And particularly when we're talking about ageing and cognitive decline, and the ability to make a decision may may reduce, and you may need that input from family members.
Can I just ask, where does the old-fashioned medical power of attorneys fit in?
So that's this one here, and that also is something that can work as well. So that still stands, and but the support person is a new sort of document, I suppose, for want of a better word, that allows you to add that person without having to make them a power of attorney. Because when you make someone a power of attorney, they can make decisions as if they were you. So if you don't want to give someone the power of making the decisions, but you want them to get the information so they can help you make the decision, then that might be a good first step.
So you can have both those things.
You can have both, yes.
You can have both, and it doesn't necessarily the person whose medical power of attorney could be a support person.
Yes.
But you could also have a different person.
You could, yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because one of the problems with a medical power of attorney, you can only have one person and a substitute. So you may want to involve more people in the decision. You may want your family to help you. So you might have 2 children who you want to nominate as support people, for example. So you can download those forms free from the Victorian Department of Health, www.health.vic.gov.au. And so clearly in the context of aged care and ageing, these types of arrangements are key to put in place now while you've got the capability of doing it. A bit late when you've lost your cognitive abilities. And then we come to the next part. So when, as I was saying earlier, when you die, that refundable deposit you've paid for your residential aged care facility, that is returned to your estate. So if you had structured your affairs and you had money in superannuation and trust and you pulled the money from those sources, you've taken it from a non-estate asset and brought it into being an estate asset. So you do need to think about that. So if you're in a situation where there's going to be there's going to be significant levels of conflict when you die, then it may be worthwhile considering paying a daily accommodation payment rather than paying the lump sum rate, just to get away from having that amount of money coming into your estate. So there's opportunities to have those conversations with your advisors before you step off and just restructure your affairs completely.
Crystal Wall places both choices.
Yeah. So the way they work is that the refundable deposit is a lump sum amount of money. The daily accommodation payment is simply the interest on that amount, and the interest is set at the time when you go into care. So if the interest rates, I think the interest rate's currently about 6%, 6.something percent, 6.1 or 2%, something like that. And so if your bond was $1 million, then you're just paying $60,000 in interest. But if your investments are earning 8, then it's not really that much of an issue if you've got plenty of assets to fund the other costs. The other thing I want to talk about here is that with superannuation. So most of you, I think nearly everyone here is a client. So most of you would have had this discussion with your advisor already that superannuation is not part of your estate. Your will does not cover your superannuation. So you can't say in your superannuation, in your will, give my superannuation to my kids. It's meaningless because it's not part of your estate. To get your superannuation into your estate so your will can deal with it, you've got to have the instruction in the super to send it to your estate, which is a binding death benefit nomination. And so that then sends the money to your estate so it can be distributed by your will. Now, binding death benefit nominations, there's 2 kinds. First kind, which is quite common, is one that has to be renewed every 3 years. Now, that has, in the context of ageing, that's got a problem. Because once you lose capacity, you can't renew it. And unless your power of attorney expressly allows your power of attorney to renew that binding death benefit nomination, then technically it lapses and can't be renewed. So what you can do is put in a non-lapsing binding nomination. For our clients, we'll know them as binding death agreements. They're written into part of the deed. They never lapse. And I would suggest that's an appropriate way, particularly for self-managed super funds, to go. The other thing to think about here is reversionary pension. So a reversionary pension, so you're retired and your superannuation paying you a pension, and your spouse is getting a pension as well. And when you die, you've already when you set up the pension, you said, well, if I die, I want my pension to go to my wife, and she can get both pensions. And that's fine, and that's automatic, and it bypasses a binding nomination, so I don't have to worry about having a binding nomination in place because it's all taken care of there. The issue that we now have is that you can only have $1.6 million in pension phase and superannuation. So from start of this financial year, so from 1 July.
So if one of you dies and you've both got 1.6, you're in a bit of bother.
Correct. And so what happens is with that is that if you've got an automatic reversionary pension in place, the surviving spouse has got 12 months to sort stuff out. And there are planning opportunities. We are all across these strategies and can help you there. But generally what happens is we stop the surviving spouse, we stop their pension, and just have that in accumulation in superannuation. But there's some strategies we can talk about with you about your own specific circumstances, if and when that is required. But certainly reversionary pensions are a very effective way to keep money in the tax-effective environment of superannuation for longer. But there are some advice needs around when someone dies. I think one of the key points I make here is that, and particularly it's particularly pertinent for second and third marriages, is that if you've got a reversionary pension in place and husband dies and the wife gets it all, it's now hers. So all that money's hers. And so she can then make decisions on what happens with those pensions. She can stop the pensions. She can give it off to her kids instead of your kids. She can remarry and restart those pensions and have them reversionary to a new husband. So you can. There's any number of iterations of how that may play out. So reversionary pensions aren't necessarily fantastic in those situations, depending on what the family wants out of their estate planning requirements. It may be entirely appropriate, or it may be entirely inappropriate. When it comes to wills, wills look after that. Anything you own when you die is passed through to your beneficiaries in accordance with your will. Anything you own jointly with another person automatically passes to that surviving joint owner. It doesn't go through your will. Without a will, the laws of intestacy apply. So that's law, that's statute. It's written down who gets what share. It's very, very set. And that can create delays. It can create a lot of disharmony in families, and can be quite messy. So I would suggest it's quite easy to have a will and write a will, and there should be no reason why any adult does not have a will. I said any adult. Anyone who turns 18, gets a driver's licence, should write a will, because if they go and get a part-time job and there's superannuation being paid, odds on they've probably got a couple $100,000 worth of insurance through that super fund, potentially. That they don't know about because they don't look at their super statements. But that's that's a reality of it. The reason I've got executives up there is that I just wanted to make a point here that your executor is the person named in your will who gets the fun job of calling in all your assets, paying out all your debts, and distributing the proceeds of your estate in accordance with the terms of your will. That's their job. They don't necessarily get paid for it. It's a responsibility. But what I would say is that they don't have to do it all. That's what your solicitor's there for. So long as you've got someone who's responsible, who's not going to just put it in the drawer and forget about it and leave your affairs lingering for years, they actually get on top of it, get things done and get things resolved, that's the sort of person you want as your executor. If you've got no one, then you have to then look at a company like State Trustees, Perpetual, those type of trustee organisations who have who are allowed to step in and offer those services. But you've got to choose wisely. And testamentary trust, and this is the last thing I want to talk about with estate planning. So a testamentary trust is a trust that's established by your will. So it doesn't come into being until you die, and the terms of your will set out the terms of the trust. Now, it sets out who the beneficiaries are and who's going to be the trustee of the trust. It can be a really good way to assist in the management of your affairs where you need income from the assets to go to one person, but the actual capital of those assets to go to other people. So often in a second marriage scenario, for example, you might want your assets to be held on trust with the income from those assets being going to your spouse who survived you. But when you die, those assets are going to pass through to your children. So there's a way of protecting your assets for your kids, but also making sure your spouse has some income to live their life. And that's a very common strategy, particularly today. Testamentary trusts are often better estate planning arrangements than superannuation. They may not be as tax effective, but they can provide a bit more certainty around planning when it comes to who gets what and when. You can also limit access to capital until beneficiaries are able to or reach an age at which they're going to be responsible with that capital. So think children, when their parents die, you wouldn't want a 15-year-old getting access to $1 million from the sale of a family home, for example. So you wouldn't want that held on trust until they reach an age which they might be able to deal with that money. You can also have protective trusts. So the beneficiaries may get no access to the capital. I remember one scenario we had with a client. It was an estate where the beneficiary could get the income, but his kids eventually get the capital because he had an alcohol dependency problem, and if he had got that capital, he would have drunk himself into an early grave. As it was, he had income to live for a very long time and actually beat his alcohol dependency as well. But because it was set in the terms of his mum's will, there was nothing that he could do to undo that. So he had just had that income stream coming through, and eventually his kids will get the assets. It's also very useful for if you've got family members with a disability, where they may be susceptible to people perhaps having a bit of a tilt at the assets, or making a suggestion that this might be a good investment over here, buying me a house, or things like that, which happens. It happens. And of course, drug dependency, spendthrift ways. You know your kids and your relatives who are going to be the beneficiaries of your will. You can make those decisions now. And just as a final note, if you've got beneficiaries who have severe disabilities and are in receipt of the disability pension, then it would be worthwhile talking to your solicitor about special disability trusts. They have some advantages because they can protect the beneficiaries entitled to the disability pension, but also give them a bit extra resource to help fund their care needs. There's some restrictions around those special disability trusts. They're not a panacea by any stretch of the imagination, but they can be part of a solution to families who are grappling with that situation.
Did I need a doctor to be there to say that I capable of signing or doing things?
I had this very discussion with someone today. One of my clients who's in her mid-90s wants to change her will. And I was talking to her daughter and I said, that's fine, but you need to understand that the solicitor is likely to ask you for medical evidence that your mum knows what she's doing. Because there comes a point at which you don't have the ability to understand the decisions that you're making. And if you're changing your will to benefit some family members over other family members, and that may be a completely legitimate situation, those who are getting less may feel aggrieved and may feel the need to contest that decision. If they win, that undoes what you've just put in place, but it may throw the whole estate up into air. The costs of those contests get borne by the estate. So there's a lot of negatives to that situation. Giving money away while you're alive is a really good option. Just saying, you've got a lot more control over who gets it. But it's a complex area, and you really need to seek specialist advice in relation to all of this stuff that I've talked about, particularly around the structures of your wills and the options that you're going to look at there, because I've scratched the surface. There's a lot more detail, and that's the devil's in the detail. And I think the key thing is making sure those documents are executed correctly. So you can go and buy the will kit from the newsagent, but if you fill it out incorrectly, and if you sign it incorrectly, it may not be a valid will. So there you go back to the laws of intestacy. So preparing now, be it for aged care, incapacity or death, means that you have some certainty. You know what's ahead of you in terms of the decisions you put in place. You put your care arrangements in place, and your family know what your wishes are. You will have had to communicate it to your family so they know what's going to happen. They know what your expectations are. Getting advice means that the taxes associated with some of these financial arrangements and the optimisation of your financial arrangements can be done in such a way that you're not going to create a problem for your beneficiaries or a problem for those left behind. And I just think, in the end, keeping this secret doesn't help. You need to have the discussions with your family about the types of care and the types of decisions you're making around this stuff, because they'll be wondering if you're thinking about it. They may even be hoping that you ask, hoping for you to talk about it so that you can have an open discussion. Some families can't do that, and I understand that. I really do. But if you can have that discussion with your family and cross those bridges now and hopefully broker the disagreements now, then it's less likely to be problems in the future. Happy to take a few questions if you've got any. Please.
Thank you so much. I found it very useful. A lot of what you've spoken about tonight is based on government policy, and I'm wondering how likely it is that government policy is going to change. Well, one of the things I discern from what you're talking about is a lot of safety netting that the government's providing to the aged care providers and others for their business models.
Yes.
And how sustainable that is. And do you think that we're going to see, in fact, a sort of an evolving policy environment that's going to actually change what you've outlined for us?
I think there's nothing more certain than change. I'm just going to open this door to let some air in so we don't die. There's probably nothing more certain than change. What I would say is that the latest budget we just had passed down there were some changes, minor changes in the aged care area, and it was all around, as you say, the safety nets for people, making sure those who are on the age pension don't have the means to look after themselves, that the government was helping them through the pension loan scheme especially, to give them the ability to pay for aged care. Because if you're on the full age pension, you don't have a lot of choices. Life's pretty grim actually if that's all you've got, because you've got to live on about $17,000 a year if you're a single person. That's the full age pension, and you're not going to have much in the way of assets. And so 85% of that will go in your residential aged care fees. So there's not a lot left over for you. And so what I would say is that the government understands that. They know that they can't afford to pay for it all. And what they want people to do is to access the assets that they own to help fund this. And it is a part user pay. I think the one development we will see in the future is, the home's not sacrosanct anymore. Australians are very attached to their homes, but I don't know that the ability to avoid paying fees because you can have a $1 million mansion and no other assets and have the age pension. I think the days of that are numbered, and that's probably, I don't know that the government that brings that law in is going to be all that popular, and may lose an election, but I can guarantee the people who take over aren't going to undo it, because you can see it coming a mile away. I think the assessment is going to have to change, but it's going to be, as you say, it's going to evolve. Those graphs showed a growing number of people. The timescale, which was pretty small, that was out to 2054. So we're talking a pretty long time, 40 odd years. But so that will actually be me in those bars.
Chris, if you've got $1 million plus house,
Yeah.
and you need to sell it and move on,
Yeah.
the moving on is almost the same cost as what you sell your house for.
Yeah, no. So what we're talking about here is going from a situation where you can no longer live independently. So it's less about downsizing your home, because yes, I agree. When people come to us and say we're going to downsize our home and we're going to have all this money left over from it, we all know to smile politely and nod our heads, because the reality is there's not a lot left over. What tends to happen is you downsize the size of your home, you upsize the quality. It's natural, human.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for that. You talked about the pros and cons of certain strategies, and the one there you talked about the low means person. I'm particularly interested in your opinion about gifting and doing that before. While you've still got the compass metas and all that sort of stuff. What are the rules today?
Well, you can give whatever you want. Yep. So if you're not in the age pension, you can give whatever you want because it has no impact. We don't have gift duties here in Australia, so it's not like America or UK. So you can give away whatever you want. Obviously, if you're giving away assets that have appreciated in value, there's capital gains tax consequences, because if you buy something for $1 and when you give it away its value is $2, you've got a $1 capital gain, you've got to pay tax on half that gain.
But your family home is exempt.
Your family home is exempt. So let's think about this through. So let's say you think, well, I don't want to have all these assets forever. I know I'm going to give them through to my kids or beneficiaries, let's call them, the back of mum and dad giving over assets. Children saying, we'll look after you, mum and dad, see ya. It's happened, and we all think it'll never happen to us. Our kids would never do that to us, but unfortunately, someone's kids have, because that's what the courts cases have all been about. And so, I would suggest that you would want to make sure, if you're gifting assets, that you retain sufficient so that you have a roof over your head that you control, and sufficient assets to provide for your needs, both now and into the future. But anything above that, if you wish to gift, that is your prerogative.
But if you give like jewellery or cash, there's no tax in it.
No one has to pay tax other than capital gains tax on assets that have appreciated in value.
And you can't give it as a loan?
That's a really interesting question. And a lawyer will say no, yes and no. I would say it depends. So the short answer is you can, but there's also a number of... the question was, rather than gifting assets, could you just do it as a loan? So let's say I've got an excess $1 million floating around, nice to have, and I decided that my children could use that much more effectively than I could, so I'll give that across. I'll loan that to them rather than gift it to them. The problem with that is unless it's on a commercial basis, so there's loan agreements in place, there's security taken, there's interest rates charged, there's repayments being made. If it's not on that commercial basis, it's probably a gift.
Well, you probably have to do that if there might be a divorce.
Yeah. But that's where the court cases have come out. So there's been a number of court cases where family loan agreements have been struck out as gifts. And so whilst you can do it, and it might be fine, it also might not be. So be careful.
You mentioned before about the 1.6 million limit on your superannuation, and that came in 1st of July last year.
Yep.
Let's say you had 1.6 million this year.
Yep.
And superannuation funds tend to, they're hoping for double-digit returns
Yep.
to 30th of June this year. You're going to have only 1.7 million this year just because it's grown.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that's okay.
That's
Is
right.
that, yes.
Yep. Yeah. So if your pension was at 1.6 last year, and that was what was recorded at 30 June last year, and then you had a bumper year, and you've now got $2 million in your superannuation fund, that's fine. Also, if it drops, it's also it doesn't go down.
Not fine.
That's not fine. It doesn't go down. That's a. I think our.
So is it 1.6 only at that point in time?
1.6 when you start pension. So whenever you put money into pension, that's that. So this is actually on a superannuation presentation, but think about it as a bank account. So you start off with 1.6 million in your bank account. When you start a pension for 800,000, you take 800 out, and you've still got 800 left in that bank account. Start another pension for 800, you've now got 0 left in that bank account. So you've got no ability to start another pension. So the pensions are over here, they're going up and down doing all sorts of things, and you're taking pensions out of them, but you can't start another pension unless you stop one of those pensions, and that puts money back into the bank account and goes up. So it's quite complex. It's very, very complex. We're all dealing with it day in, day out, so we've got a head around it, but it is something that we've had to grapple with. There's a lot of detail in that, a huge amount of detail in that legislation.
Can I say a comment, not a question?
Please.
This is not so good on financial things, but Mum, we always thought that Mum would live at home. We wanted to be able to do that, but Mum ended up in hospital last year, and so we decided, I just said to Mum, why don't we look at retirement villages and things and just see what they're like? And we've actually both been encouraged that it's not like it was 30 years ago, and there's actually some really nice places. So, but one of the things, I'm going to Mum, I'm going, Mum, I think we might want to get some financial advice with this, because the way that they lay out the things, like it's not apples, however you say it, it's not one thing matches the other and you can make a comparison. It's like this one has this system and then this one has this system, and it's like, I have no idea how the finances work.
Yeah, and we can help with that. So that's something we can help with. So retirement villages are not governed by federal legislation; they're governed by state legislation. You may have heard of AVO, who were in the press last year for some of their contracts. So the contract is the key thing in a retirement village thing. So generally, what you're looking at is about a 30% loss of capital, roughly. And if you are happy with that, go for it. But what you've got to watch is, what you're looking is the deferred management fee. So what are they going to take out of it when you exit? One of the things I've had trouble with is actually getting the money out of them. So the retirement village units stayed vacant for, I think it was 18 months, until we forced their hand by ringing the CEO of the organisation. It was a very large firm. I won't say any names, Stockland. It took 18 months to get that money out of them, and it was just a debacle. It really was a debacle, and it was just poor management on their part. And so that's the one thing. And then the third one is watch the monthly maintenance costs.
Yeah.
because they can be quite high and quite out of step with what the unit facilities are. So it's about, you've got to, in the end, it's a judgment rule, and so long as you understand the cost structures and you're comfortable with the financial wherewithal to cover those is there, that's fine. And the other thing I would say with that is, think about what happens if Jean can't live there. If you get to the point where you need residential care, where you need someone,
which we're looking at, both, like going, okay, is there
you need the ability to move
transition?
in.
That is exactly what we're looking at.
And so, but the key.
As I'm close to Box Hill Central, I think it's going to be a question of parking that makes me move to the area.
Fair enough. So with that, the key thing to think about is, moving into residential care, you'll still need to pay a refundable accommodation deposit, and you may be in a position, if most of the asset is tied up in the retirement unit, you may not have the capital when you need it in the time frame that you need it to pay that refundable deposit. So you need to budget for for perhaps paying the daily accommodation payment until such time as you get the money from the sale of your retirement unit to pay for that deposit. So because it's not under the same banner, you go from one system to the next.
This is why we're